Mm-mm. My name is Dorothy Simmons. I am 63 years old, and for most of my adult life, I worked as a records clerk at Millfield General Hospital in Columbus, Ohio. 31 years. The same building, the same fluorescent lights, the same smell of antiseptic and old coffee that seeped into everything, your clothes, your hair, the inside of your car even after you drove home. I started that job when my daughter was 2 years old and my son had just turned 5. I left it 3 years ago when my knees started giving me trouble on the stairs, and my supervisor, a man 20 years younger than me, began scheduling me for fewer and fewer hours without explanation. But this story doesn't start there. It starts 2 years ago after my husband passed. Raymond died on a Tuesday in March. Quietly, the way he did most things. He had been sick for a while, his heart, and we knew it was coming the way you know a storm is coming when the air goes still and the birds disappear. But knowing doesn't prepare you. Nothing prepares you for the morning you wake up, and the other side of the bed is just cold sheets. After Raymond died, our daughter, she lives in Charlotte now, wanted me to move down there with her. I thought about it for a long time. Longer than I should have, but this house was where we raised our children. Raymond built the back porch with his own hands. I wasn't ready to leave. So I stayed, and I found myself, at 61 years old, needing something to do with my hands and my mornings that wasn't sitting in a quiet house listening to the refrigerator hum. I took a part-time job at Carver Community Center on the east side of Columbus, 3 days a week, sometimes 4. I helped manage their after-school program, keeping records, calling parents, organizing the calendar for the tutors and volunteers. It wasn't hospital work, but it felt like something that mattered. The kids there were loud and honest, and they didn't pretend. The center closed at 8 in the evenings on the days I worked. I don't drive at night anymore. My eyes aren't what they were, and Raymond always used to drive us after dark anyway. After he was gone, I never got comfortable with it again. So I started taking the bus home. The Route 17 ran right past the center and stopped 2 blocks from my house. Most evenings it was fine. I'd sit near the front, keep my bag on my lap, and watch Columbus go by through smudged windows, strip malls and laundromats and church marquees with their weekly messages. The driver on the evening route, the one that ran from about 7 to 11, was a man I came to know as Walter. I didn't know his last name for the first month. Walter was a big man, broad-shouldered, somewhere in his mid-50s, with close-cropped gray at his temples and a voice that always sounded like he had something more important he was about to say, but decided against it at the last second. He wasn't unfriendly. He just wasn't chatty. He said good evening when you boarded and thank you when you stepped off, and that was usually the extent of it. I noticed, around the 3rd week of writing his route, that he brought his own coffee in a thermos, a beat-up silver one with a blue lid that he kept on the little ledge near the fare box. He'd sip from it at red lights, and I could see from the first row, where I always sat, that by the time he reached my stop around 8:15, the thermos was usually empty. It was the end of October. Cold already that year. I had been baking banana bread that Sunday because it was something Raymond and I always did together on Sundays, and I didn't know how to stop doing it alone. I wrapped up 2 slices in foil and put them in my bag on Monday without really thinking about it. When I boarded the bus that evening, I pulled them out and set them on the ledge next to Walter's thermos without saying much. "Banana bread," I said. "I made too much." He looked at the foil package. He looked at me. "Thank you, ma'am," he said. That was all. But the next Monday, when I stepped onto the bus, he nodded at me in a way that was different from how he nodded at everyone else. Slightly, just enough. I started bringing something every week, not every day. I didn't want to be a bother, and I didn't want it to become something obligatory for either of us. But once a week, usually Mondays, I'd bring a little something wrapped in foil or tucked in a small container, cornbread, peanut butter cookies. Once, a slice of sweet potato pie. He always said thank you. Never asked for anything, never expected it. But he started holding the bus an extra few seconds when he saw me coming down the sidewalk from the center. Just a few seconds. Enough so I didn't have to run. I noticed things about Walter, the way you notice things when you have a lot of quiet time and not enough people to spend it on. He kept a small photograph tucked into the corner of the fare box display, too small and angled for me to see clearly, but it was there every day. He never spoke on his personal phone while driving, not even at long lights. He had a habit of adjusting his mirrors twice at every stop, even when they didn't need adjusting. And sometimes, when the bus was nearly empty and the streets outside were wet and dark and the lights blurred through the windows, he'd go very still at a red light in a way that wasn't just waiting. It was the kind of stillness that comes from carrying something heavy for a long time. I recognized it because I'd felt it in myself. We didn't talk much that whole first month. Then one evening in November, there were only 2 other passengers on the bus, and they were both in the back with headphones on, and something about the particular quiet of that night made conversation feel natural. "You work at the community center?" he asked. Not accusatory, just like he'd been holding the question for a while. 3 days a week, I said. After school program. He nodded slowly. My nephew used to go to a program like that, over on Livingston. Did it help him? He thought about it honestly. Some, he said. That was it. But it was something. Over the next few weeks, pieces of Walter's life came out the way. Pieces of a person's life always come out if you give them enough time and don't push, in small fragments, dropped casually, only when it felt safe. He had driven this route for 11 years. He had a son named Marcus who lived in Dayton. They were not speaking. He didn't explain why, and I didn't ask. He owned a dog named Pepper, a beagle mix, who he described only once and with an affection in his voice that he didn't use when talking about most things. I told him about Raymond. Not everything, not all at once, but enough. I told him Raymond had worked for the city for 30 years and that he laughed too loud at his own jokes, and that the house still smelled like his aftershave in certain rooms if the windows stayed closed. Walter listened to all of this, the way people listen when they actually understand what it means to lose someone. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said eventually. "Thank you, Walter." He had started introducing himself by name at some point. I'm not sure exactly when. The winter settled in properly by December. Ice on the sidewalks, the kind of cold that gets into the joints and stays. I had started wearing Raymond's old scarf, a dark green wool one he'd had for 20 years, because it still smelled like him, and because I was cold, and because some habits are just too hard to explain. There was a man who had moved into the house directly next to mine sometime in the fall. A younger man, maybe late 30s, early 40s. He introduced himself when he moved in, said his name was Craig. Said he was transferring for work, something in insurance. He was polite at first. Helped me carry a heavy bag of birdseed to the backyard once, without my asking. Waved when he saw me getting the mail. But somewhere around late November I started noticing small things that I couldn't quite name. He seemed to be home at strange hours. His car would be there at 2 in the afternoon, then gone, then back by the time I left for work, then gone again. I'm not a nosy person. Raymond always said I was the least nosy neighbor we had ever been. But when you live alone and the house next to you is occupied by someone you don't really know, you notice rhythms, and his rhythms didn't make sense. Once I came home later than usual, closer to 9, and I saw him standing at his front window in the dark, not with the lights on inside the way you'd stand looking out at something, in the dark, just the shape of him behind the glass. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that living alone made you read things into nothing, that grief sharpened certain fears and blunted others. I locked my doors and I went to bed. But I started deadbolting at night, which I had not always done. One Monday in January, I brought Walter a container of beef stew. It had gotten very cold, and I had made a large pot over the weekend because cooking for one is its own kind of loneliness. You make too much and then you eat the same thing for 4 days or you give it away. I preferred giving it away. He thanked me and set it on the ledge, and we rode in comfortable silence for a while. Then I said, without really planning to, Have you ever had a feeling about someone that you couldn't explain, where nothing specific happened, but something felt wrong? Walter was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. What did you do? Paid attention, he said. Paid closer attention. I didn't say anything more about it. I don't know why I brought it up at all, except that I had been carrying it alone for weeks, and it had started to feel heavier than I could account for. February was when things shifted. I came home one evening to find that the potted plant I keep just inside my front door, a small jade plant that had been Raymond's mother's, had been moved. Not by much, maybe 6 inches to the left, but I know where I keep things. I've kept things in the same places for 30 years. That plant has sat in the same spot since 1987. I stood in my doorway for a long time looking at it. Nothing else seemed out of place. The doors had been locked, the windows were latched. I checked every room, which took longer than it should have because my heart was going too fast. Everything was fine. Everything was exactly as I had left it, except the plant. I called my daughter that night. She told me I'd probably moved it without noticing and forgotten. She said that kindly, the way children say certain things when they're trying not to say they're worried about your mind. I let her believe I was convinced. But I knew I hadn't moved it. After that, I started paying closer attention the way Walter had said. I noticed that Greg's car was parked differently than usual on the days I worked, angled slightly, always facing my driveway, which was a small thing but noticeable. I noticed that on 2 separate occasions, I saw him in the parking lot of the grocery store I use on Thursdays, even though I had never seen him there before in 4 months of being neighbors. Once might be coincidence. Twice started to feel like a pattern. I didn't say anything to anyone except, obliquely, to Walter. I didn't describe Craig by name or say anything definitive. I just said, one evening in late February, that I'd been feeling uneasy, that I thought someone might have been in my house, though I couldn't prove it. Walter turned off the radio that he usually kept on low. "You live alone?" he asked. "Yes." He was quiet for the rest of the route. "When I stood to get off at my stop that night," he said, without looking away from the road, "I'm going to pull 2 stops past yours tonight." "I'll walk you." I started to object. I said he didn't have to do that. "I know I don't have to," he said. He pulled 2 stops past mine, put on the hazard lights, walked me to my door. He said nothing else. He waited until I was inside, and the deadbolt clicked, and then I heard his footsteps back down the porch steps. I stood in my hallway for a moment, holding my bag, with the strangest feeling of being looked after, that I hadn't felt in almost 2 years. The following week, Walter was not on the Route 17 when I boarded. A different driver, a younger woman I'd seen occasionally on the morning routes, was at the wheel. She was perfectly fine. She said good evening and drove well, and I had no complaints. But the bus felt different. Emptier in a way that had nothing to do with how many people were on it. I thought about the photograph tucked into the corner of Walter's fare box display. I thought about his son in Dayton who wasn't speaking to him. I thought about his dog named Pepper and the way he went still at red lights. He was back the following Monday. I didn't bring anything that day. I had forgotten, which wasn't like me, but the previous week had unsettled me in ways I was still sorting through. I just sat down in the first row and said, "Good evening." "Evening," he said. We rode for a while without talking. Then he said, without any preamble, "I want to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you react." My stomach went tight. "All right," I said. He kept his eyes on the road. He spoke in the same steady way he did most things, without rushing, without softening it unnecessarily. He told me that last week, on the evening he had walked me to my door, he had noticed something before he turned back to the bus. My neighbor, the man on the right side, had been standing in his side yard in the dark watching, not doing anything, just standing, far enough back from the property line that it wasn't trespassing, close enough that it wasn't nothing. Walter had made a note of it. He had taken out his phone and taken a photograph of the man standing there. He told me there was more. He said he had a cousin who worked in property management and handled tenant background screenings. He said he hadn't gone searching for anything, but that the name on my neighbor's mailbox, which he'd happened to read when he walked past, had come up in a conversation with his cousin not long ago. He said he wasn't certain, and he wasn't trying to alarm me, but his cousin had mentioned that name in connection with an eviction dispute in another part of the city that had involved a restraining order. A woman had filed it. His cousin didn't know more than that. I sat very still on the bus. Outside the windows, Columbus was doing what Columbus does in March. Half-thawed, uncertain, the streetlights reflecting off puddles the color of old metal. "How long have you known this?" I asked. "About the name, a week. About watching your house. Since the night I walked you to your door." "Why didn't you say anything sooner?" He paused. "Because I wasn't sure. And because I didn't want to frighten you with something I couldn't confirm." I understood that. I'd spent 2 months not saying anything for the same reason. I told him about the plant. He listened. He didn't say I was imagining things. "You should talk to someone," he said. "Not me. Someone who can actually do something." I called my daughter that night and told her everything. Not the soft version. All of it. She drove up from Charlotte the next morning. She was the one who contacted the non-emergency police line. She was the one who found the name of a victim's advocate through her workplace. She was steadier about it than I was, which is how it goes with daughters sometimes. They become the parent for a while and you let them. What followed was not dramatic in the way things are on television. It was slow and procedural and exhausting. A police report. A conversation with the advocate. A call to a lawyer my son-in-law found through his firm. What we found out with time was that Craig, his full name was Craig Teller, had a documented history of fixating on women who lived alone. There had been 2 incidents in other cities. One had resulted in criminal charges that were ultimately reduced. The restraining order Walter's cousin had mentioned was real. He had never technically broken into my home. What he had done, we believe, was obtained a copy of my key at some point, possibly through my building super, who had given him access to fix a small plumbing issue in October before I'd thought anything of it, and entered while I was at work. Once, possibly twice. The moved plant was not nothing. My instincts had been right. He was gone within 3 weeks of the report, evicted by his landlord once the situation became clear. I don't know where he went. I don't need to know. What I carry from all of it is not the fear, though the fear was real, and it was with me for a long time. What I carry is something else. I think about Walter going still at red lights and deciding at some point that staying quiet about what he'd seen was worse than the awkwardness of saying something. I think about the photograph on his phone, a stranger's neighbor standing in the dark, taken at 11 at night by a man who had no reason to get involved, except that he had walked someone to her door because something felt wrong. I called him a few weeks after everything had settled. I got his number through the transit authority, which took 3 separate phone calls and a letter explaining the situation. When I finally reached him, I didn't know what to say. So I said what was true. I said, "You paid attention, and it mattered." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You brought me beef stew in January when it was 14 degrees outside. That matters too." I laughed for the first time in what felt like weeks. He told me in that same conversation that he had called his son in Dayton. They had not spoken in 4 years. Something about the whole situation, he didn't say exactly what, had made him pick up the phone. His son had answered. They had talked for a long time. I don't know what happens after that. I'm not the kind of person who needs to know how every story ends. But I know they talked. I know that much. My daughter wanted me to come to Charlotte again after everything was resolved. I thought about it longer this time. I'm still in the house, the one Raymond built the back porch on. Some mornings it feels too quiet, and some mornings it feels too quiet, and some mornings it feels like exactly enough. I still take the Route 17 on the evenings I work. I still sit in the first row. I brought Walter lemon pound cake last Monday. He thanked me the same way he always does, simply, without fuss, like a man who receives kindness the way it's meant. And I thought, sitting there in the first row while Columbus passed outside the window, about how thin the line is between being safe and being in danger without knowing it, about how often the thing that pulls you back from that edge isn't a system or a structure or anything you could have planned for. It's just someone who noticed, someone who was paying attention, someone who knew your stop. Be kind to the people you see every day. Not because you expect something in return, not because it makes you safer or wiser or better than you were before. Be kind because they are carrying things you cannot see, and so are you. And sometimes that is enough of a reason. It was enough for me. I've thought about this a lot since everything happened. Not obsessively, I'm too old for that. But in the way you turn something over in your hands when you're trying to understand its weight. What protected me wasn't luck. I want to be clear about that, because it would be easy to frame it that way and move on. What protected me was a chain of choices made by ordinary people over ordinary months. Walter chose to pay attention when most people would have looked away. I chose, back in October, to wrap up 2 slices of banana bread and set them on the ledge without expecting anything back. My daughter chose to drive 4 hours without asking me twice whether I was sure. None of those choices felt significant when they were made. That's the thing about the decisions that actually shape your life. They rarely announce themselves. I think about Craig sometimes. Not with anger, though I won't pretend the anger was never there. I think about what kind of person moves through the world the way he did, choosing to make someone else's quiet life into something frightening. And I think the honest answer is that it starts small, with small dishonesties, small violations, small moments where a person decides that what they want matters more than what someone else deserves. It compounds. Everything compounds, in both directions. Dorothy, the version of me that exists on the other side of all of this, is different from the woman who moved that jade plant back to its original spot and told herself she was imagining things. She trusts herself more, not in an arrogant way, in the way that comes from having listened to your own instincts once and found out they were right. That's something I'd pass on to anyone who reads this. Your discomfort is data, the feeling that something is wrong even when you can't articulate exactly what. That feeling has been refined by every experience you've ever survived. Don't talk yourself out of it just because you can't prove it yet. Pay attention. Then pay closer attention. Walter taught me that without meaning to. He is not a dramatic man. He does not make speeches. He noticed something, filed it away, and when the moment came, he said what he knew. That's it. That's the whole of what he did. And it was everything. I think about his son Marcus in Dayton and the 4 years of silence that ended with a phone call. I don't know what Walter said to him. I don't know what Marcus said back, but I know that something in Walter shifted during those weeks, something about watching a woman choose to stay present in her own life, to not disappear into grief or fear, made him decide he didn't want to keep disappearing from his son. One person's quiet resilience can reach further than they'll ever know. That's the thing about how we treat each other in the small, unremarkable moments. It doesn't stay contained. It moves. It changes things downstream that you'll never see. I'm still in my house. Raymond's scarf is still on the hook by the door. The jade plant is exactly where it belongs. And on the evenings I work, I still sit in the first row of the Route 17 with whatever I've wrapped in foil that week, resting on the ledge next to an empty thermos. Some things are worth continuing, even when, especially when, someone tried to take them from you.